Good morning. My name is Matthew Burrows. I'm the Director of Foresight in the Scowcroft Center of the Atlantic Council. And it's my great pleasure to introduce this session, which is today about launching a report on the demographic trends in Western Sahel. Now, Africa is the only region in the world where the number of people living in poverty will increase by 2030. The Sahel is the poorest region in Africa and the most youthful. This region, though, as we will show in the report, doesn't have to have a future of increasing poverty and economic stagnation. This is why we talk about futures. The choices that are to be made are, of course, those of the region. But this report shows different pathways to, one thing, a brighter future, or more of the same with even more serious implications. Now, I want to introduce the speakers, but before I do, I would like to thank the Children's Investment Fund Foundation, CIFF. They are the sponsor for this report. As the name indicates, they are dedicated to improving the lives of children and mothers, particularly in Africa. And they wanted this report to show the importance of demography when we're talking about Africa futures, and to bring this report, the demographic story, much more to just not the NGO or the demography community, but also to the national security community. Now, we have 4 speakers. We'll begin with the 2 authors, one of which is Richard Sincata, somebody I have known since, I think, 2007, who worked with me at the National Intelligence Council. He is currently a global fellow at the Wilson Center's Environmental Change and Security Program and senior fellow at the Population Institute. Secondly, the other author is Stephen Smith. His title is Professor of Practice of African and African American Studies at Duke University. He was formerly deputy editor of Le Monde's Foreign Desk and Africa editor at Libération. His article, Macron's Mess in the Sahel, has recently appeared in Foreign Affairs. As I said, they will brief the report, and afterwards we will have a panel discussion, which will also include the 2 authors. And for that panel, we have invited Alex Ezra, and he is the Dornsife Professor of Global Health at Drexel University. Alex is a public health demographer and was the founding director of the African Population and Health Research Center in Nairobi. He is a recipient of the World Academy of Sciences 2018 prize for the social sciences, and the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine and Royal Society for Tropical Medicine and Hygiene's 2020 George MacDonald Medal. And finally, we have Karen Hardy, who is president of the What Works Association, and also a public health demographer with decades of international experience at USAID, the Population Council, and the other reproductive health-related organizations. So I'm going to turn it over to Rich and Stephen to begin on the briefing.
Thank you, Matt. I will briefly introduce the region also as a coherent unit. So we are looking at the Sahel, and there's obviously the climate zone that you see here in green, stretching all across south of the Sahara Desert. We are talking about 6 countries, all Francophone except northern Nigeria that we included. The coherence of that unit is not only demographic, but also historic. It is the contact zone between North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa. Perhaps more importantly, it is also the region that saw the first state formations, pre-colonial state formations. So long-distance trade made state, and states organized this trans-Saharan trade here, beginning in the 3rd century. And so you have the Mali, Ghana Empire, the Boko Haram, and so all across here. And this was actually historically the heartland of Africa, the most important part in terms of pre-colonial state formation, and also for the trade until the victory of the caravel, the first ship that could sail against the trade winds, and that was the beginning of the transatlantic slave trade and a shift of the gravitational importance of the interior toward the coast, and coast West Africa became relevant, whereas the Sahel impoverished in a way. So this is the sort of what brings together this region. Our study is a demographic study with an adjunction of other sciences that we won't talk very much about today. Agronomy, so we look also at livelihood and pastoralist communities and sedentary peasants, ecological conditions. But today we will concentrate on what is the most fundamental commonality of this part of the world, and that is a very youthful population age structure. And Richard will go into detail to explain how this is the bedrock of perhaps the matrix of the future as we try to present in this report.
Okay, thank you, Stephen. We've argued in this report that demography is of utmost strategic importance to the region and thus to the world, but poorly understood by political scientists and economists. And in this graph, we show the senior citizens on the bottom and axis. On the vertical axis is young people younger than 30 years. All these dots are the nearly 200 countries of the world, and they go from countries that are age structurally youthful, that is, wide at the bottom where there are children and adolescents and are in the majority, and then to age structures that are much more mature that have a narrow base of children and many more seniors. The red zone here is the area of youthful populations. It's significant because that is where the highest concentration of countries involved in civil conflict, the most unstable democracies, the poorest countries, the countries with the highest rates of infant mortality and maternal mortality, that's where they exist. Getting to the next zone, which the UN Population Division has called the demographic window, is of utmost importance. And why? Because by that time, age structures have become more cigar-shaped, where the rates of workforce growth and the rates of children coming into the school age have declined significantly. And these are what we call development favorable age structures. And here's the problem of the Sahel, is that they are concentrated not only in the youthful part, but also in the most youthful part of the youthful section of the age structural transition, particularly those inland countries of the Sahel. So how do you get out of this bind, the youthful section of the age structural transition? Fertility decline. That's the only way out. And it's extremely important that countries go through this fertility decline. Here's median age, the demographic window that I talked to in blue, and fertility, and that they go and that fertility declines and that they enter the demographic window. You can see the changes in age structure as they do. Getting below a fertility rate of 2.8 gets you ultimately gets you into the demographic window. And without that, you remain in this vulnerable situation. Okay. What happens in the demographic window is of utmost importance, because that is where countries make the sort of upper middle categories of the World Bank's income classes. And some countries, some political scientists and economists have said, well, all they need is better leadership. And we're not arguing that leadership is required in these countries, but we're also noting that countries with youthful populations have problems governing. Government effectiveness is low, scored low. Political stability is low, and these are World Bank indicators that are shown here. Now, next we move on to population, everybody's favorite subject, and less so for demographers, not because it isn't important, it is indeed important, but with countries with youthful age structures, population is almost already decided. In the period of this report till 2045, population is bound to double in the region. There is some wiggle room from effective programs that lower fertility, but between high and medium is only about 50 million population, and so getting to around 400 million is almost guaranteed by 2045, 2050. Oops, move past that one. Okay, what can you say about how to move into the demographic window? Well, countries are already trying that in Africa. Here's the mean years of schooling, modern contraceptive use, and this is girls' education, and the different coded colors represent weak, moderate, and strong family planning programs. And as you can see in East Africa, many of the programs are quite strong, and fertility, modern contraceptive use has increased. And but in the Sahel, marked in red, most of these countries have moderate or low effectiveness of their family planning programs, effort of the family planning programs, and very low levels of girls' education. And this is a graph done by Karen Hardy and John Barnegartz. So what I'll wind up with is a look at some of the examples of successful programs that are highlighted in the publication. You can see Burkina Faso's age structure over the last 40 years, which has barely changed. But in that same period of time, Tunisia has gone from a very youthful age structure to one that is on the verge of looking like industrial country age structures, well into the demographic window. How did it happen? Through a process of policies and programs that promoted women's rights, an approach that was very much top-down by an authoritarian who had a significant political capital. Next is Botswana. Less decline, but a professional program based upon healthcare, much in the model of Western countries. And free access to family planning programs, to modern contraception, and a strong effort to get girls into school and keep them there, and they've been very successful at it. And the third is Bangladesh, which actually resembles the situation that Sahel has been in for the last 40 years, which was initially early and forced marriages and very low use of contraceptive, contraceptives, and through the last 40 years, the Bangladesh Ministry of Ministry of Health has coupled up with a very efficient NGO and foreign donors to sort of skirt the problem of a kind of an ineffective government. And meanwhile, its programs have been based upon a community-based approach where local health workers go out and provide contraceptive commodities to their customers. And with that, I'll turn it over to Stephen.
Yeah, perhaps the originality of what we were trying to do was to lay out the facts, as Matthew said in his introductory remarks, show if you do this, the following will be the outcome. And so we tried to combine that with scenarios, which I give only as vignettes here because obviously we go into more detail. We have 3 scenarios about what the region could look like by the end of the time period that we consider, 2045. And as Richard said, the population overall will grow from 180 million right now for the Western Sahel, and either up to 370 million or 420 million. I'm just putting this up front to show that the room for maneuver is actually quite small. It's about, like Rich said, 50 million, that's 15%, and I will come back to this to show that there is a significant difference between the different scenarios. What we have said so far, in essence, means that in countries with ever-growing populations, the demographic investments, which means the building of roads, schools, houses, hospitals, universities, etc., is very difficult to achieve for governments. And so youth bulge countries are generally poor, poorly governed, and most often involved in war, very often internecine war. And this situation leads to the poor governance. And when I introduced the region, I didn't speak about the fact that the Western Sahel has become the Islamic insurgency, the fastest growing Islamic insurgency, which is an outcome, an outflow of what it just said, the difficulty of meeting the expectations of an ever-growing population. I'm not going into the finer points of a youthful population, which is more important than just the mere number of people living in the countries, but just as a shortcut. So the first scenario would be more of the same. And that sounds falsely reassuring because we live with what is happening right now. So we have 180 million people living in that part of the world. We would have 370 million by 2045, and we would expect that that would be pretty much an undramatic or not totally dramatic situation. You know, it depends a little bit on the countries, whether you look to Mali or you look to Senegal, there are differences. But in actuality, I just give you one example, unemployment. Niger, I take the worst case scenario, Niger's remunerative positions that are actually available today are 350,000 jobs. This includes the informal sector. Right now, each year, 250,000 newcomers arrive at the job market, and they will be 550,000 at the end of the period that we considered. There is no way you can create that sort of jobs when 1 year of newcomers could actually take over all the positions that are actually available in the country. So more of the same is not meant to be reassuring, but it is the persistence of trends that are already there, which means a lowering and erosion of fertility rates with an urban-rural divide. So in capital cities, you would be fairly close to replacement level or come close. It depends also, obviously, on socioeconomic stratification. But you would have a very strong divide between the cities and the rural hinterland. You would also have a food situation that perpetuates food insecurities. You would have a patchwork of Islamist insurgency regions, so it would probably, the government would be holding the cities and the hinterland would more often be insecure. Female empowerment would continue to increase, but you would have still this principle of seniority that would prevail. Most importantly, perhaps, there would be strong migration as there already is. Think about a doubling of the population. The proportion of people who have the means to migrate would further increase. So you right now have something like 200,000 people each year on average that arrive in Europe. So the relationship, the neighborly relationship with Europe would most likely be marked or characterized by Europe trying to fend off these migratory waves and doing so by what the EU already does, funding police states to keep people in place. I leave it at that. To continue with the second scenario, which is the downward spiral. Obviously, the Islamization of the region would increase. I prefer that word because it's not necessarily jihadism that spreads. It could be jihadism, but it could also be policies and political culture like you already have in Turkey, or which means parties of justice and development. And you had parties like that already in Morocco, so it's already in the region. But it would exacerbate the fighting in the region for sure. The downward spiral would mean that you would not achieve all the gains in terms of girls' education, contraceptive use, and aggravate the situation also in terms of food security. You would need to expect in that scenario that you would have outright famines, for example, in Niger, and that the government would control cities that would be more or less really besieged by jihadist warlords and probably more jihadism than Islamist governance. Our breakthrough scenario is a reproductive turnaround. That is really looking at family planning and implementing policies. Now, I spoke about the fact that this would increase the likelihood of meeting these demographic challenges to some extent. 370 million people is far less than 420 million, but it would not be immediately breakthrough. In a way, we could call the breakthrough is the condition of the possibility of a breakthrough to come. I will come back to that. Given the fact that there is less penury to share and more relative wealth, the possibility of regional integration, the possibility of a more constructive relationship with Europe under less migratory pressure, possibility of circulatory migration, all these possibilities would increase, and the food security would also be better, far better than it would obviously be in the worst case scenario. When I say the possibility of the condition of the possibility for a breakthrough, this is just a fact or linked to our time frame. By 2045, the improvement would not actually be a breakthrough, but the breakthrough is that by 2050 and beyond, you would reach that demographic window of opportunity for sustained economic growth that Richard spoke about. You would reach it much earlier. So this is the condition to actually a brighter future, and therefore it is much more important than the 15% would lead us to think. But just like to conclude, because I think this today is mostly about having an exchange and answering questions and going into the directions that people may be interested in. All the details obviously figure in the report. The report is also now out in French, so it's available, obviously important in the region that is mostly Francophone. And finally, we will be in West Africa. We hope to be in West Africa in the first half of May. And from our dissemination tour in Europe last fall, what my recollection is mainly donors throwing their hands up saying, yeah, we are aware of those challenges, but we actually don't have the language to speak about it with our interlocutors in the region. And so, as I think Matthew pointed out initially, this is laying out the facts. The decisions to be made in this domain obviously belong to the Sahelian populations and their leaders, but I think it is important that the depoliticization that has prevailed so long, for example, when it comes to female empowerment, that everything is pushed into the corner of public health and depoliticized, that we find a language that is not aggressive and that allows us to get into a conversation, because there's not an inside and an outside. I think it comes through when you think about the relationship of West Africa with the rest of the world, not only Europe. Only half of the migrants go to West Europe. The other half goes into the rest of the world, a share proportion also to the United States. So we hope to be out in the field and have a possibility to do what I hope we will also already do today here, find a language that allows us to discuss these issues factually and perhaps also politically. Thank you, Karen.
Thank you. Rich and Stephen, thank you so much for this report and for your presentation of it. We do tend to think of population size and growth when we think of population, but you've really demonstrated how important age structure is and the youthful population in the region. We're going to have a discussion, and I welcome everybody on Zoom and in the audience to type questions into the Q&A, and we'll take those a little bit later. But first, I'd like to turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Alex Eza, to give some comments and feedback. Alex.
Thank you, Karen. And thank you, Richard and Stephen, for the presentation and for the report. It was a pleasure reading this report. And I want to start by saying, I don't know, for people who might be in the audience as well as people virtually, you might be here because you're interested in security issues in the region or the population growth that might be happening there. Simply, you're a development person, but whatever the perspective you bring to these issues, I think it is important that people read the report themselves and see what the recommendations there are. If I feel, for me, one of the disappointments, if I would take it from like that, of this is that we are having this dissemination here in Washington, D.C. at the Atlantic Council. I wish we were sitting in Niamey or N'Djamena or Ouagadougou or even Abuja or Dakar to discuss these issues, because it is really important that these are questions that we need to deal with and address within the region. But let me start with my reflections on the report itself. Stephen, you ended with the three scenarios, which is continuing as usual, more of the same, and a downward spiral and breakthrough. And if you read the report and you look at the breakthrough scenario, and you touched on it again, the breakthrough scenario, which looked like a positive future in some ways, is actually very depressing if you look at the content of it in many ways. And it is very depressing because the conditions that will be essential and critical to bring a much brighter future for the continent is the barest minimum that people could think about as where we need to be in order to change things within the continent. You talked about the change that's likely to happen between now and 2045, and the population growing from about 180 million to almost 370 million or 400 million. And this is based on the UN Population Division's projections. The UN population projection and all the other projections, whether you look at the Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation at University of Washington or the Wigginstein Institute in Vienna, all they have done in their population projection is looking at what's the trajectory of fertility and mortality. At the global level, migration is zero, net migration is zero. So you look at those things, and even now that they are using a Bayesian hierarchical model to project that population, they are looking at what's the path fertility will likely take. And you can make adjustments to fertility schedules by looking at what's happening to family planning, to female education, but all these things are affecting the fertility that you will likely be experiencing at the country levels between now and 2045 or 2050 or 2100. What has not happened is, and in the report you touched on it, but you did not get into details of it, which was the fact that if you looked at prior projections of countries in the region and West Africa in total, and you compare that to recent projections, the UN gives you the low variant, the medium variant, and the high variant, that over time, you can take two projections that may be 20 years apart. Their 2050 projected population do not even overlap between those two projections. And what does that tell you? That the downward spiral scenario, the chances that we will exceed that level of population growth in the region is real. Why do I say that? One of the major factors that drive population growth that we have not been able to pay much attention to is age at first birth. And in many of these regions, age at first birth is still around 18 years. Compare that to 31 years in South Korea, in Ireland or Spain and other places. It means that if you think about a 90-year window, in these other places, you will get 3 generations of women if you give birth at 30. In the region, in the Sahel, if you give birth on average at 18, you will have 5 generations of women. Even if you model fertility as being the same across these two settings, you will have 5 generations of people. That's a 40% increase that has nothing to do with the fertility schedule that is being factored in. And that's why we see this rapid continued growth within the region. But that's one point. You also talked about the fact that the window between the medium variant and the high variant is very minimal, which is about 50 million people. Now, how do you get to those variants? You get to them by looking at if fertility is half a child higher or lower than what is being projected to be, what would that population be? You look at South Korea with a TFR, total fertility rate, of 1.05. A half a child change is a 47% decline or increase in the projected fertility. In Niger, with a TFR of 6.7, that's a 7% change. So you only need to go 7% outside of the trajectory to be outside it completely. But that's also a unique opportunity, because it means that if you can actually change fertility and affect age at marriage and many other things that affect fertility significantly more than the half a child, you can bend that curve significantly much lower. And it is critical, because at the rate of growth, you made a point that we cannot recreate and build schools and hospitals and train teachers and doctors and everything we need to keep the current levels of inadequate services and amenities across the continent where they are. But what are the solutions? I think some of the things you read in the report is that we need to invest in family planning, female education, and the normal things we do in development and all of those. But to be honest with you, think about all the countries that have made significant progress in terms of reducing fertility over the years. How many of them, and in how many of them have you actually seen that change being driven by external players? It doesn't happen. Whether you think about Bangladesh, that was given as an example here, the role that ICDRB, International Center for Diarrheal Disease and Research, and BRAC played in driving the program there was very significant. And in many other parts of the world, that has been the thing. And within the region, you can think about investing in female education in the Sahel now. Think about northern Nigeria with the Chibok girls and what has been happening with the abductions of girls from schools. How do you sustain a development program or a program that's supposed to drive population growth down in these settings if girls cannot even go to school? It doesn't matter how many billions you pump into that. It is a failed approach in many ways, because the circumstance and the environment does not support those. So where does that take us to? Is the role of institutions, local institutions that need to drive these conversations. And that's where I started, as well, my regret being that we're sitting in a very nice place at the Atlantic Council doing this, and we have to do a few presenting it and all that. That we need to begin to invest in creating local institutions that can generate this knowledge, use it to engage with the government, and not just government, but the civil society and the communities in these countries to begin to win hearts and souls and minds around our common shared destiny if we cannot get grips on these situations. The point is not about whether there will be 4 billion Africans in 2100 or 6 billion Africans in 2100. It's a question of what type of Africans are we going to be having in that. I'd rather that we have 3 billion well-educated, healthy, productive citizens that are contributing to the development not just of the region, but of the world, than to have 6 billion that are barely surviving. And for us to get there means that we need to be able to change the model we have for development. I think the model we have for development has really failed us over the years. It is a model that is founded on humanitarian assistance. Whether you look at the World Bank, 1948, end of Second World War, you look at all the international NGOs, they come out of whether it's the Korean War, or the Biafran War, or the First World War. And that's the mindset we have. When organizations are at that point, you talk about where they need to make that transition to a more favorable demographic age structure, we cut off support to them. And so you have countries that will actually rebase their economies to remain where they are simply because it is more favorable and responds to the global development agenda that we have. I don't have anything against our doing humanitarian assistance. We need it more than ever today. But we need to separate development from humanitarian assistance and plan development as a strategic investment in places where we need to make progress. And we begin to see countries that are actually demonstrating that progress, and then invest in them and have good cases of progress within the region. Then they will become the ones and the anchors that will drive the rest of the region upwards. You can use Bangladesh in the region and what they're able to do, and people can model and see, okay, we could do this, we can achieve this, it is possible. But if we continued with this attention to really being where and agendas that are driven largely from here, it becomes very difficult to connect with the realities and the thinking on the ground. So I go back to the role that local institutions would need to play to carry this message forward and to be able to make it resonate with Africans in Africa, to see that the issue, and I just maybe make one last point here before I close. And that's the fact that you talked about the issue of conversation and language that we are using. And it's not just that it is difficult to talk about that because of the political connections and difficulties there, but increasingly it's going to be difficult to discuss these types of issues even at the global scene. And the reason is simple. In many of the high-income countries, OECD countries and all of that, that fund some of this work in the region, they are dealing with the challenges of population decline, and it's going to accelerate. And they're adopting policies that favor more, you can call them more pro-natalist in many ways. And they are the same people that will then inform or support family planning programs in the poorest countries. That will create ethical concerns both in the North and in Africa. And we need to be able to create the language that will allow us to recognize those patterns, and increasingly divergent patterns of population change are critical to address and to improve human well-being. We cannot sustain it whether it is declining very fast or growing very fast. And we need to be able to see that it is okay and normal to talk about those different trajectories and have different policies in place that can help address them. I think that's where we need to get to. But to get there, we need a much stronger voice and a much stronger platform for Africans in Africa to begin to advocate these issues and drive the policy and program action that will be needed to change the situation on the ground. I'll stop there for now, but thank you.
No, thank you.
Thank you.
Alex, thank you. Thank you so much for those comments. And I want to pick up also on the language issue, because we know population is such a sensitive topic. You talk about it in the report that it's sensitive among policymakers. It's sensitive at the global level. But I've also heard African women say, you know, in our countries, when the population is growing so fast, it's women and children who suffer. So I couldn't agree more with all of you that we absolutely have to find this language to talk about these things. And your report, it just it cries out for solutions. And Alex, I really agree with you about the institutions and Africans having a voice and having support to do this. So I won't be in the launch in West Africa, but I look forward to it because that's the launch that's the most important for this report. I just want to, and it's really clear that women and youth need to be part of the solutions to address these really complex issues that are addressed in your report. Before we start the discussion, and questions are already coming in, which is great. I just want to make a couple of points, and one is who pays, and the second is what programming. In the OASIS report that I think is a companion to your report, it said that $1.3 billion is needed to sort of close the gap in girls' education and family planning. And this is the G5 of the Sahelian countries, including $107 million for family planning. So who pays for that? What is the likelihood that governments in the Sahel in these countries will be willing to or even able to pay? And what percent of that should governments be expected to pay? And then what donors are there? Alex, there were a lot of donors in Bangladesh, including BRAC and ICDDRB, and I think it was the partnership that really made the difference. So, what donors are funding girls' education and family planning in the Sahel, and what will they be willing to pay? The assistance has intensified, particularly for family planning, since 2011. That's 11 years ago, 12 years ago, for family planning through what was called the Ouagadougou Partnership, where 11 donors got together to sort of collaborate on funding for family planning in 9 countries. USAID is part of the Ouagadougou Partnership. And I say this because Congress has just decided on funding levels for this fiscal year, and once again, funding for international family planning is stagnant. It's been stagnant for over a decade. So we've seen increased population growth. We know that everybody's facing inflation now, and we have stagnant funding. So our institutions like USAID are expected to do more and more and more with less. And why is that important? It's actually important because USAID is the top donor for family planning and has been for decades. So USAID funding levels for family planning in global international family planning, they actually really do make a difference. Where's the Asia Development Bank? They're funding, they're doing a lot with COVID right now, which is really good, COVID funding, but what about family planning? And they're also funding some girls' education, but what about family planning? The second point I just want to make is what programming. There was again a sort of the OASIS group got a lot of stakeholders in the region together to talk about what should be funded in terms of family planning in the region, and they said, let's stop looking for new things. Let's focus on what we already know is working, and let's scale up that programming. They've they have a lot of suggestions of particularly getting community health workers, which was one of the very sort of actions that worked in Bangladesh, getting community health workers to go into communities and gain the trust of communities and serve women in those communities. Postpartum family planning, there are a lot of times that women can be their needs met in the postpartum period. So that was another area. They also said reaching men, engaging men, which is really critical in this region with there's high desired family size in the region. It's got to be a community effort with engaging men in the process, including men as partners of their wives, but also community leaders and religious leaders. We know a lot, and child marriage, you've said, Alex, you made a really clear point that, when girls get married so early, they start having children so early. There's a lot known about child marriage in the region, including the need to really understand context. It's not as though it's uniform all across, Burkina Faso or Mali that's all the same, that you really need to look at place with a sort of a geographic perspective and a community perspective, so that, and then engaging, we know a lot globally. We have, Girls Not Brides, so many initiatives looking at male engagement, looking at child marriage, looking at high impact practices, what works in family planning, but those absolutely have to be contextualized. And those need to have African voices contextualizing those. The women and the youth need to be the ones involved in that. And what about multisectoral programming? The Sahel Stephen, you showed the sort of ecological side of it. You didn't spend a lot of time in the presentation, but clearly that's a huge issue. So should we be having more programming that is, that links people and the earth, basically, in the environment, environmental stressors, and of course now climate change. Can we shout out for girls' education and family planning, which Project Drawdown says is a best buy for climate? Why can't climate funding be used to fund family planning and girls' education as part of resilience and adaptations? There have been some successes in the region. I mentioned the Ouagadougou Partnership. They increased over their first decade, 3.8 million additional contraceptive users. That's good. That's it's not enough, but it's needed. There are promising signs, particularly Senegal. Very promising statistics in Senegal. Some promising statistics. Now we have annual surveys. So an annual survey in Burkina Faso that shows more increase in contraceptive prevalence maybe than we had thought. And the Demographic and Health Survey, which of course is our gold star standard demographic survey, is in the field in Burkina Faso right now. And so we should have results by the summer. But I think we have to hold on. As you say, Alex, it can be really depressing when you look at the statistics. I think we have to hold on to the successes and really push the successes and increase funding for this work. Advocacy and policy champions are huge, and they've been huge all over the world in family planning success stories in Indonesia, in Rwanda, in Ethiopia. The list goes on. So finding policy champions, maybe it's a first lady, maybe it's a parliamentarian, with again funding local civil society groups to do that is going to be really important. So those are the points that I wanted to make, and I think maybe we could open it up for Stephen and Rich if you have anything to add to what we have said, or questions or comments about what we've
Perhaps
said.
I would just, I very much appreciated your incisive, and I think you have gone a long way in trying to keep us honest in your way of reading the report, and I'm really grateful for that. I think I'm just trying to go even further, if I may. You see, one of the difficulties is that I think that empowerment is almost a contradiction in terms. So this morning I looked at the report that the European Union brought out together with all their partners, and the European Union is a major player in Africa, so they had a lot of African input. And it's a study about Africa in 2030. And much to my dismay, not so much to my surprise, there's not a word of family planning in that report, and not a word about demography. So one of the difficulties that I think you really teased out very well is the ethical problem that we will be facing with saying we have pro-natalist policies in the north, and we will have in the global south policies that seem to totally contradict that. Everybody will read that also in ethical in ethical terms, and it will be a potential for conflict. And at the same time, how do you actually, there's not much of local capacity building in our report, and I'm quite happy about that, because I don't, look at Mali, look at the military and the civilian side. Decades have gone by with local capacity building, which has been an industry for the north and a failure in the south. And so how to get this conversation going without being in an environment where you cut between the inside and the outside, as if we weren't in this all together, and as if there weren't this interplay that I think you also mentioned. So I think this is where the sort of frontier lies for us, getting out of DC, of course, getting into the field, but the field is everywhere. It reminds me a little bit like the talk on campus of the real world. Campus is as much real world as the rest, and I think the questions that we try to raise in that study, and that obviously are beyond our purview and responsibility, quite frankly, to take them into the field where it is, and it is all over, is the real challenge, to get this conversation going in the terms, I think, in these very candid terms that you used. I hope we will find many interlocutors to talk to in the months to come. So thank you for that, in essence.
Thank you so much, both of you, Karen and Alex. You brought up some excellent points, and that some of which we haven't really covered in enough detail in a short report.
Yeah.
I think one point that I would like to make is that development is a difficult thing in that you're trying to put yourself out of business. If you're doing it well, and at the same time, you want results so that you can show that you've had success. Now, public health programs like family planning are not done by Europeans or Americans overseas. They're done by people who are invested in them in those countries. And the problem is that development donors are picking the priorities while the problems are local and the investment should be local. So the way to get through this is for every dollar for results, you want to have a dollar that builds capacity in terms of girls' education and public health, basically. And that's a difficult thing to do when you set up a cooperating agency or a superstructure that's built basically as Alex said, on a kind of emergency model. I always think of it as the missionary model, that you were out there to help people, and then their job is over when they're helped. But it isn't. It's just beginning. So the question to me is how do you turn things over as quickly as you can? How do you build the capacity in countries that are still very youthful? That is, they're not able to train as many people as they wanted to. They're not able to move the age structure up into a point to tax people as much as they could, or they need to, and yet they need to spend, along with donors, along with along with the foundations, they need to build capacity. And it's been done to a certain extent. In some countries, it needs to be done more throughout West Africa and the Sahel in particular.
If you have to take it over, probably you have already had a false start. I would argue that's one of the difficulties. If you have to hand it over at one point in time, I think you had a false start, and that is how I think we need to think about these policies more radically and the interaction. If someone is in charge and someone else is supposed to, at a later stage, take it over, I think this is how most of the programs have been run, and quite frankly, I don't see them as being very successful. So the sort of revolution is not on one side; it's also very much on our side.
Mm-hmm. And the projects and programs from donors are developed, a few years even before the project starts. And then if there are policy changes, which we have seen, and you have to defund local organizations because they're not in line with your policy, that causes huge disruption also. But Alex, there are also over the years, most international organizations that are doing programming in the field are mostly staffed by local, by people from the country. So do you see that as some kind of progress or halfway progress?
Actually, that's, it does not change.
It doesn't change the
It doesn't
fact.
change the fact. The question
Yeah,
is, where
yeah.
does the development dollar and investment go?
Right, right.
And what are you leaving behind if that program is supposed to leave or finish? And we should recognize Africa is 54, 55 countries with populations of 200,000 in some to 200 million. And it's quite vast, and we recognize that. But when we think about these programs, we think country. And yet, the problems that we have, I mean, you're looking at the Sahel, you can interchange any of the indicators from one to the other in many instances, commonly shared across countries and things like that. And there's very limited effort to actually connect the dots inside Africa in our programs. We go in there, we might go from Washington, D.C., and we work in Ghana, we work in Senegal, we work in these places, but the people that work on these programs do not know each other. They don't connect in many ways. And that's a problem. You look at the research, the World Bank showed that 78%, up to 78% of the research that come out of East and Southern Africa are with external partners, and only 2 to 3% are with other partners within Africa. That needs to change. We need to be able to connect, and if you think about building stronger institutions, it's not just enough to have them as national institutions. They have to be such that they're able to draw expertise from across the continent to address those problems. That's the way you elevate these institutions to a point where they have a platform to speak on these issues at a continental level. If you're still running a $2 million operation in one country like that, your opportunity to stand and speak about these issues continentally is very limited. If you have a $100 million annual budget and program and you're working in 10 countries, you can attend the head of states meeting in Ethiopia and talk about some of these issues. You create platforms. So what we're looking to see is how do we, it's not about having Africans work on the project in the field. It's about who thinks about the projects.
Yeah.
How are these priorities developed? Whose priorities are there? And how are they, I mean, I led an institution for many years in Africa, and I can tell you, yes, a number, whether it's PEPFAR or USAID, many times USAID Forward wanted to move significant parts of its budget to local, but how successful was that? If the biggest concern funders have is the fact that they think about the capacity of the institutions on the continent, that they are too small, and if you have a $2 million budget, you can't get a $20 million grant and all that. But we've been doing this thing for 20, 30, 40, 50 years. And if in 2022, we're still talking about limited capacity and weak capacity in this continent, it's an admission that we have failed in our effort, because there's nothing that we have done in Africa that has not included capacity building as an integral part of those programs. So why are we, 50 years later, still talking about weak institutional capacity in those countries? It means that whatever we are doing is not working, and we need a different model. And that model means identifying even institutions that are not yet where you want them to be, and taking the risk on them to make significant investments that gives them the bandwidth to create the systems and processes that you need to be in place, so that in 10 years you can look back and say, this is how far we've come. But the thing is that with development mindset, it's still the whole thing that if you get to a point, I tell you, if you get to a particular point, people think you don't need help anymore. I saw that in Nairobi. Somebody came to our campus, APHRC, and then looking back, saw the big building and said, you don't need help anymore. I looked at the person and said, look, if you stop funding Harvard today with their $38 billion endowment, in 10 years, you will not recognize the institution. Why do we always fund where we think they need help, they need us? And why can't we identify those that are actually making significant progress, make significant investments in them, and see what they're able to produce the next day? But once you get there, is the orientation that we have to development, that if you've gotten up there, if you've reached that threshold, then we need to look for somebody else to help. And development is not about helping. It's about building together a structure and a system that supports long-term improvement in a country.
Sounds a little bit like medical triage. You would have to choose the person that you tend to, and that may, cross the threshold. But it has, it has cruel implications, which is that you, disregard other then deemed to be hopeless cases. I do not disagree, but it's a tough business.
But that's where you then do humanitarian assistance. Maybe they need help with some emergencies, and you take the approach that has been there. But if you actually think about this, and truly, who is driving development thinking globally? And I think that's where the crux of the matter is to me, is that the model that we have doesn't seem to work. And if we are going to build, if we are going to make a change, if we are going to change the trajectory of population growth on the continent, we need to have institutions on the continent that understand those, do the projections for the region, and present it at different forums, and engage with communities and governments to share the results of such research, and say, this is the future that we are headed to unless we do A, B, C, D, E. And in those A, B, C, D, E, contextualize it in such a way that you get into a community, they understand what you're talking about.
Right, right.
It's not just women's empowerment. So somebody will say, what is it exactly? What are we talking about? And we know that in many instances it has led to greater problems for women, if it's not planned well.
If it's not done right.
Yeah, where you get the money, it leads to greater domestic violence and all that, or debt. And so we need to, development is something that needs to be built on a core structure that is anchored on local knowledge and data systems and processes. And I don't know how else. I guess I'm coming to it because as I look at how many different countries have made this progress and this transition, you can always identify the critical institutions within those regions or countries that were at the forefront of those conversations. And if you don't have that within the Sahel, Western Sahel, it would be difficult to drive sustainable change in the region. It will be, sorry to say that, you can, Afghanistan is the recent case, 20 years. And after the US pulled out and the partners pulled out, we see where we are. And that's the role that institution building would play in sustaining development investments within countries.
But those institutions, once they're built, still need to be funded.
Oh,
So a
absolutely.
big question is where the continued funding is going to come from. But I want to just turn to a question from the audience, the wider audience, and that is that somebody writes that they're disturbed that the only routes forward focus on reproductive rates, fertility rates, in one of the regions regions with the lowest population density. Any ideas instead for expanding the numerator economic growth? So I think
Want to address?
While we were concerned about the fact that this is was at least relatively low density region.
Right. So not clear that population is an issue there.
I don't think of global population as a way to approach this. In fact, if you're really approaching age structural issues, it's at the family level, at the community level. Programs are for people, and the state should be there to benefit, to support it, because ultimately, as we've shown from age structure, it's age structure that has helped contribute to the formation of viable states. If you don't have viable states in West Africa, that's, I think, one big ingredient is that you're constrained by your age structure. You're in what people have called a low-income, high-fertility trap, which is just not those two, but also all kinds of health issues, all kinds of environmental issues, and ultimately all kinds of civil conflict issues. So to me, it's almost befuddling, I think, when demographers look at Sahel or West Africa or any other part of the world where high fertility has been an issue, that it seems not to show up. I was just actually as a point of discussion, I was just in a conference where the first session was on demography, and it was led by two West African political leaders, and as they talked about demography, they never mentioned two words, fundamental words. One is fertility, and the other is woman. These are this is the essence of programs that they ultimately affect how the state functions. Should be a lesson for a lot of the people in this building, basically. I mean, why aren't we talking about demography in the same way we talk about agricultural development, about political institutions? Because they're inseparable, and that's probably the best way to characterize the research that has come about in political demography and in political and in economic demography. That you can't separate this development from the achievement of the demographic window. You got to get there, and without getting there, you're unable to create a worker bulge, a tax base, ultimately give retirements, ultimately run your own country. And that's where we got to go, and we need to do it together. I don't see it as an issue of population,
Yes,
global
Stephen.
population size.
Just a very brief word
Yeah.
on that. The report doesn't make an argument of overpopulation or a Malthusian argument at
Right,
all.
right,
And if you
right.
look also to be positive about it, Ivory Coast, for example, was the country in the world that dedicated the highest proportion of its national budget to education. So the question is not that you move from 3.5 million Ivorians to 20 million today since independence. The argument is, while you have a policy of creating, Yamoussoukro is known for its basilica, but it should be known for the excellent schools that were built by Houphouët-Boigny. But nevertheless, 50% of Ivorians today are illiterate still, because each generation is bigger than the previous one. So these demographic investments, that's not about overall population density. Africa is still not a densely populated continent, but the question is, how can you provide for these ever-increasing generations, education, security, employment? I mentioned the job market in Niger. When a single generation of newcomers to the job market can actually take over all the jobs that are available in the country, there is no way to say we will just increase the jobs. So the argument, I think I obviously understand, but it is not about overpopulation at all. It is about how you can actually politically match or fill the gap between the legitimate expectations and what is actually available for people.
Alex?
And I think the person that asked the question, I think is really a misunderstanding of size and rate of growth.
Right.
We are not talking about the size. If the population is there, there's really nothing you can do about it. It's there. But the question is, how fast is this population growing? You look at the SDG 2015 to 2030. In 2015, the population of sub-Saharan Africa was about 958 million. By 2030, it will be about 1.4 billion. That will be 46% larger than it was 30 years earlier. That's in 2015. It means that in the period of 30 years, we have to almost increase by 50% the number of schools that we have, the number of teachers that we have, the number of health centers that we have, in order to cater for people at the same level at which they are being catered for now. And you can, even if you invest 50% of your budget in schools and hospitals and all of those, you still have many other things to deal with security, with energy, with agriculture, with all of those. So it is impossible. The question we are thinking about is not is not the size, it's the rate of growth. Can it grow at a level where we can make sufficient investments in each child and in each African to improve the human capital of that person so they can achieve their full potential? That requires nutrition, that requires education, that requires health, that requires decent jobs. And you cannot do that if every 30 years your population doubles.
Right, right. Right. Here's another question. It says, Dr. Eze raised the important issue of age at first birth and its implications for population growth and age structure. What are the investments, interventions that can address this issue from a rights-based perspective? And I actually, this is something that I think about a lot because I do a lot of work on rights-based programming and just thinking a lot, can you talk about population and rights, in the same sentence? And I say, yes, you can, and that we have to. I think this is sort of a little bit what I was talking about with the demand side programming and social behavior change to change social and gender norms, because we need to make sure that it's even in the calculus of choice for a woman to even, in a region where, yes, it says desired family size is high, but does a woman even know that it might be a possibility to choose a smaller number of children, and even think about what that might mean for her, for her life, for her children's life? So I think that this kind of programming is really important. So now that you've had a chance to think about it.
I think it is definitely one of the things we cannot do is go back to coercive programs of family planning and all that. It doesn't work, whether it's in China or India. But the point is this. Within sub-Saharan Africa, we know that 1 in 4 women, in many places 1 in 5 women who want to delay childbearing and stop childbearing are not using family planning. So even meeting the needs of these women will reduce overall rate of growth by almost 20% or more. Just meeting the needs of the 25% of, or 24% of women that have a met need for family planning. And these are people that, we know that some of the reasons why they are not using may be because of concerns they have about side effects and all of those. But do we even know how much of these concerns are rumors or real? We don't know the concerns of women who use family planning with side effects. And so if we can actually collect that data, it means that we can tell whether these are real and use it to counter the negative arguments and all of those about family planning. So there's quite a lot of room and bandwidth to make a difference there. Increasing the age at first birth, age at first marriage in many countries where it's still, for religious reasons and cultural reasons, you give exceptions and you plug all those holes and say no child marriage, and we enforce it. I think if you cannot, just take a policy. If you can't vote, you should not get married. And if age 18 is the minimum age to vote, then it should be the minimum age. And if people who do not marry at 13 and 14 and 15, and you create opportunities for them to go to school, by the time they are 18, they may be making different decisions. And so instead of, it's not that at 18 everybody then marries. Many of them will now go to school, marry at 22, at 24, and all of those. Each of these things will help us achieve the development goals we have as a country, as a region. Because what are those goals? You want to reduce maternal mortality. You want to reduce child mortality. Right. We know low age or early age at first birth increases maternal deaths and increases child deaths. So if you delayed entry into childbearing, you will improve these outcomes. If you increase family planning access, you will do this. And these are all right-based in many ways. So if we can do those, if we can meet the existing need, there will be no need for coercive thing. And I've seen in places where you've made family planning services available, women have used it, whether they are educated or not educated. And if you look at the difference between East and Southern Africa and West and Central Africa, is that a lot of the family planning programs are within public sector. And many women who use family planning, 80 to 90% of them get their services from the public sector. In West Africa, it is different. almost 40 to 50% of the use are in the private sector. So they are paying for it already. So if you actually could make them available and accessible, many more women will be able to use it, and it could drive significant changes in the population trajectory.
Yeah. Do any?
Yeah,
anything to-
I would have thinking along the same lines that where family planning and girls' education have been difficult to accept culturally, and let's face it, that the areas that where high fertility is maintained, there have been traditional and religious reasons for, or at least excuses for, keeping girls out of school and denying women access to services. But those have generally been overcome other places in Southern Africa and in Asia by giving women the chance to space births and delay them, to overcome the riskiest types of births and save themselves first, save and strengthen their children, later put their children through school by having children spaced and nursing them for a longer period of time, and ultimately, in the later part of development, using it, family planning, for their own careers, to promote, to be able to function in the workforce and in public life. So that's a long road to hoe, but it's also it's a progress from that should be easy for local leaders to understand the ability to save women, to save their own lives, to manage their own lives, and to promote child survival.
And you actually don't have to leave the region, because if you think back the mid-1980s, you had Sankara. I don't want to put him on a pedestal. It was not an elected government. But it was very popular in West Africa, a progressive, youthful regime, pretty much in sync with the population. And no one came up saying it was un-African to promote women and to have women for the first time in government, and all the policies that were implemented by Sankara. So I think there's, even within the region, or it's actually happening on the ground. You go to Dakar, it is a function of socioeconomic stratification, but these are models that are not imported. These are models that are already in the region. And if you think about looking broader into broader sub-Saharan Africa, you go to East Africa, Southern Africa. So I think all this discourse of traditional impediments and it is antagonistic to Islam, I don't want to qualify it, but I think there's a way to talk about that makes it clear that there is not this divide, and that it is not modernity against tradition or westernization against Africanness. And so I think there's actually a path forward to talk about these things, and actually a lot of things happening in the region. It's just not totally visible. And I found it interesting to see if we could only meet the needs that are already expressed without even thinking about creating or bringing people to express needs. If we could already meet the needs that are expressed, we would probably move get the movement going.
Start the cycle, yeah. And I think for our field, the 1994 International Conference on Population and Development, the Cairo Conference, that really repudiated targets, any kind of coercive programming, and shifted the narrative and really the programming in family planning to be much more focusing on quality of care. And since the 2012 London Summit on Family Planning, really much more of a focus on rights-based programming. So while human rights conventions and ICPD said governments absolutely need to be thinking about their demographic contexts, but what they can't do is anything coercive to force providers or women to use either family planning or certain methods of family planning. And so now we've had, all these years, we just celebrated the 25th anniversary of this conference. that we have so many materials, all the training that has been done is focused on quality, focused on rights, focused on access, accountability. So I think again, that's a bit of a misguided fear to think that if you talk about population, you're automatically talking about, oh, it's got to be coercive programming. I think we need to get so beyond that discussion. So I'd like to turn to one more question. I'd like to know what impact rapid population growth in the Sahel will have on the securitization of borders and conflicts like ethnic violence and extremism. I study pastoral security in Mali, and tensions have been inflamed by a complex set of factors like land tension and political weakness.
Yeah, well, we explored that a bit as much as we could in this report. I think when we came into the report, I personally wanted to see what kind of impact climate change was having on the region, and I personally graphed a data set that are available. I found that of course temperature is rising, and but the trend in precipitation is not really. It's somewhat ambiguous. It's not. There wasn't a sort of a cyclic pattern that was still prevalent throughout the 80s of about 11, 14 years of drought and rain, and then drought again and die-off of cattle. But now cattle numbers are increasing. The vegetation has changed dramatically over the last 100 years from a rangeland that had a significant portion of perennial forage to one that is largely opportunistic annual forage. Animals move around in large herds controlled by sometimes absentee landlords. It's what people, livestock owners. So what people call neo-pastoralism, a development that has a lot to do with population because the numbers of pastoralists, people with rights to those lands, has grown. Meanwhile, the number of people who are using agricultural lands are impinging upon pastoral lands, the best pastoral lands, and even some of that which was cultivated by agropastoralists. So a lot of people are saying, oh, it's all climate change, but this has been going on for centuries, as well as cattle raiding. And it's very, very difficult under conditions of growth of people who have license to this land or traditional access to deny them the ability to increase their herd numbers and to try to make a living. What we have now is instead, under neo-pastoralism, is a group of impoverished herders who work for large herders, and like cowboys did, and have to and are very often protect cattle and have very little stake in this themselves. And this group has become marginalized, and another source of recruitment for jihadism. One wonders, with the enormous growth of cities that are going to happen, what's going to happen in urban slums as well? Will we disenfranchise this group of people as well? Is it possible to satisfy them with services and education? And that's what these governments have to do. They have to get ahead of urbanization. They have to somehow pull people off the land and attract them to a lifestyle that is urbanized, and provide some kind of, help them make a living for themselves in those environments.
Perhaps also because there's talk about securing the borders and there's a lot of talk of ungoverned spaces. I think we have been a little bit misled because there's a lot of social control. You don't necessarily need to deploy the army along the borders. I think this is totally impossible. And secure with police forces. When you look from an African perspective of what we call militant Islamism or jihadism, a Nigerian scholar came up with what I think is a very productive notion, which is theocratic populism. This gap between the expectations and the fulfillment of those expectations. As Islam is the cultural and political matrix in which grievances are expressed, not necessarily with an AK-47, but the fact that the French move in 2013 to Mali and they try to find jihadists and they end up finding pastoralists, they find sedentary, the Dogon and the Fulani, and they don't recognize the jihadists they came to fight in the first place. Is this our mapping of our fears, some of them obviously legitimate, I don't want to talk them away, but our mapping on Africa of our expectations and the little knowledge, the scant knowledge that we have of local realities, which could be cigarette smugglers or other people who try to make a living, all this is connected to these demographic trends and issues far more than the idea of having, you know, Swiss-style security at the borders. That's not really what we're looking for. And many of the ungoverned spaces are very, very secure, because I've never been in any part of Africa where people would not take care of anyone moving through the region without having necessarily police forces or military contingents in that region. So demographics, just the last word also to the fact that we don't speak about democracy very much in this context, even though we speak a lot about stability. Half of the population, more than half of the population, has no stake in democracy because they can't vote. So perhaps we need to have a discussion of lowering the voting age. Why would adolescents who take on responsibilities far greater than middle-class American adolescents, why shouldn't they have a say in the future, the political future of their countries, and perhaps take the risk of voting as early as from age 16? Or just some of these ideas. Demography sounds a little bit like age pyramids and far-fetched, but it can be very, very concrete also politically.
There are so many excellent questions. I wish we had another 30 minutes, but we don't. So I'll turn it over to Matt to close us out.
Well, thanks. I mean, thanks to everybody, including Karen, who did double duty here, both providing some real commentary and moderating the other comments. So thanks to Rich, Stephen, Alex, and Karen. I'd urge everybody to read the report. This is the French version, but we have an English version on the website. Please read it. There's a lot more that we didn't get to that's in the report. And I'd also urge everybody to publicize. I mean, you all have your networks, so please push this, the report out to others. We will be going to Africa, to Alex's comment, which I think is very well put. We have plans in early May, really, to visit some capitals in Africa and try to get the discussion going. But obviously, take your point, particularly about the need for local institutions to take up this message. So thanks to everybody, and hope you found this discussion really valuable.